Hello everyone, Professor Krizlik here. So I wanted to make a video with an update on the Russia-Ukraine war and a pretty good source for weekly updates on the conflict, and then talk about the highlights from this week's publication. So the Harvard Kennedy Center, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, puts out a weekly update to what's happening with the conflict on their website, Russia Matters. So I'll put the link down below in the description. It's a good resource if you're looking for weekly updates, daily updates on the conflict, on what's happening in the Russian Federation. So every week they compile some of the main news stories that have occurred over the past week, 8 days. I mean, it's a pretty good resource if you're maybe not reading the news every day and you just want to read what's happened over the past week, or maybe you missed a few days of following the news. It's a pretty good way to keep up to date with what's going on in the conflict. And so I just wanted to talk about the most recent publication they put out, which was Russia in Review, January 23rd through January 30th. So the end of January's report. So to try to help us understand what's been going on in Russia, what's been going on with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I'll give you a pretty quick, it's a pretty long document they put out. It's pretty detailed. I'll just give you a quick structured overview of what has happened with the Russia-Ukraine war over the last week of January. Again, the 23rd through the 30th. So there were really, if you're reading Russia Matters, there are really three big storylines to keep in mind. First, and maybe there's some contention about, okay, is this actually going to hold? We've seen Russian strikes in early February that seem to push back against, will this pause actually occur? But at the end of January, it was being reported that there was a limited pause in Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not a full ceasefire, but instead a pretty narrow and kind of a tactical pause that appears connected to the US mediated diplomacy and the extreme winter conditions that Kyiv is facing at the moment. Sorry, I had to pause. My dog was, she's eating like a toothbrush, and she's very loud at it. So the second thing that was highlighted on the website, on the news recap this week, was that the war's pressure point this week was energy and civilian infrastructure, with major blackouts, severe cold, and fresh evidence that Russia's winter campaign is still aimed at breaking Ukraine's power grid and grinding down civilian life. So if you remember last winter, weekly articles about the Russian authorities targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, trying to maximize the suffering during the winter period in Ukraine. So it seems like this has been a continuation of last year's aims and goals from Russia. So third, in the background, there is a strategic deadline, the possibility expiration of the New START Treaty on February 5th, which could leave the United States and Russia without binding nuclear limits for the first time in over 50 years. Now, again, this is just a news recap leading up until the end of January. If you are reading Radio Free Europe this morning, there's an article about that sides are pushing to make sure this doesn't lapse, but we're still not there yet. So this would leave a gap for the first time in in over 50 years. So let's walk through each of these stories. Again, keeping in mind that over the past couple days, it may have changed a bit, but these were really the main news stories and what we should be keeping an eye on as we work our way through early February. So first, let's think about diplomacy and the we'll say so-called peace over Kyiv. Last week, President Donald Trump, the U.S. president, publicly claimed that he personally asked Vladimir Putin to halt strikes on Kyiv. He framed it as a humanitarian step because Ukraine was experiencing extraordinarily cold winter conditions. What makes this notable is that the Kremlin, through Dmitry Peskov, essentially confirmed a halt on attacks on the Ukrainian capital until February 1st. Again, we've seen strikes resume. So again, it was just a temporary pause. So here is an important point for us to keep in mind. This is not a complete ceasefire, and it's not even clearly like an energy ceasefire in a broad sense of stopping to target Ukrainian infrastructure. It looks more like maybe a confidence building gesture with tight limits, limited on the time period for the end of the month, limited in geography, and limited in what it actually changes about the war, which as we enter early February, maybe not much has changed in the conflict itself. Thus, in practical terms, there were reports of maybe quieter nights in January with less attacks or lacking of attacks in Kyiv. So it does suggest that the pause may have been real, at least for a short window of time. However, at the same time, Russia did continue, as I mentioned at the outset, launching large numbers of drones and missiles into other parts of Ukraine, especially the eastern and southern regions tied to the front line. So Kyiv may have got a temporary reprieve, but the country as a whole has still been under attack. So this matters because it highlights a reoccurring pattern in this war. Narrow tactical adjustments can happen even when the broader strategic contest continues relatively uninterrupted around other parts of the country. So we've seen that sometimes this has occurred because of negotiations, sometimes it's because of weather, maybe logistics or messaging, and sometimes it's simply because one side is trying to shape perceptions to look reasonable, to maybe split allies, or to simply buy time. So, the second piece of diplomacy that we should talk about is the talks themselves. We've seen multiple reports, multiple newspaper reports, suggesting that negotiations are taking place in Abu Dhabi, with another round expected around February 1st. So, as I'm making these reports of more negotiations. So what has been especially interesting about these talks are how that there's more engagement between Russia and Ukraine than we've seen for a while. If you've been following the peace talk discussions, oftentimes there would be an intermediary where the Russians and the Ukrainian groups would not speak to each other. So here we see that more Russia-Ukrainians actually potentially working together to find a resolution to the conflict. So there's a big takeaway here, though, and something to think about, is the sticking points remain unchanged. Even if these peace talks look a little different and who's sitting at the table might be a little different, the biggest sticking points appear unchanged. Territory in eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donetsk region, and the future of the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukraine's position remains that any territorial concessions are unacceptable without ironclad security guarantees from the West. Russia's position remains unchanged, that it wants Ukraine to accept Russian territorial demands and to treat those demands as the basis for ending the war. So if we're watching these negotiations, maybe as a political science student, this is a classic bargaining problem under fire. Both sides want a deal on terms that the other side sees as dangerous, illegitimate, or politically impossible. So let's move on to the second big storyline that Russia Matters wrote about. The winter energy war and the ongoing humanitarian impact. So last week's news coverage brought stories about Ukraine's energy situation. The country's largest private energy company, DTEK, reported that Russian attacks had destroyed and disabled something like 60 to 70% of its generation capacity. The practical results of this in sub-zero temperatures is rolling blackouts. In some places, civilians are reportedly getting only 3 to 4 hours of electricity per day. There was a story on NPR about how diesel fumes can be smelt across the country, as it's really one of the only ways to run generators and to sustain businesses and to sustain households beyond this limited capacity. So the energy situation is rather dire. This isn't just a discomfort for those in Ukraine. This is also a strategic pressure from Russia. Energy infrastructure sits at the intersection of military strategy and civilian life. If you degrade a power grid, you don't just simply turn off the lights. You disrupt heating, water pumping, communications, hospitals, industries, and transportation. You also push people to flee, and displacement is politically destabilizing over time. And what we see last week is the continuation of a winter campaign aimed at breaking systems, not just winning battles. So there's also an international response dimension here that we should include. European aid packages, emergency funds, and deliveries of generators are part of how Ukraine keeps functioning under these stressful conditions and the stress put on by Russian bombardments. So if we want to understand how modern wars are fought, we don't just look at the front lines where the battles. We've read a lot about the re-emergence of trench warfare. We also look at supply chains, the infrastructure, and the coalition politics that keep a society running. Okay, so now let's look at the third storyline, which is the battlefield. So on the map, the Institute of the Study of War puts out fantastic maps that show the territorial changes in the conflict. The ISW is a source worth having in your repertoire of daily news reading. So let's talk about the battlefield. On the map, the pattern remains with Russian making incremental gains rather than dramatic breakthroughs. These are claims of territorial gains in places like Donetsk, the neighboring regions. But the broader point is that Russia is advancing very slowly at a very high cost. Rather than achieving sweeping operational collapse of Ukrainian forces, the Russians are making incremental gains at, again, a high cost to equipment and human lives. So this matters because it tells us something about capability and limits kind of on both sides. Russia has minimal but still some momentum in places, but not the speed or the scale that would suggest an imminent decisive victory. Ukraine is holding on, but often under pretty extreme strain from the Russian engagement. And so that brings us to what is probably an important battlefield constraints mentioned this week, which is manpower, enough people. Multiple reports over the past week have described Ukraine as facing pretty severe shortages of troops. In some sectors, Russian forces have said to outnumber Ukrainian ones dramatically, even up to 10-1 in certain areas. These are also there are also accounts of unstrengthened battalions, units that should have hundreds of soldiers but are operating with just a fraction of that, with only some portion considered combat ready. So the bigger analytical point here is rather simple. A defensive line is not just territory, it's also personnel density. If you don't have enough troops to defend every sector, gaps open, and those are the gaps an advancing army looks for and can take advantage of. So we've seen that there are a few big changes this week and some not huge changes. Again, the territorial gains that the Russians are making are minimal, but they are still gaining territory. There's still concern about attacks on infrastructure and what will happen here as we enter the beginning of February. Will the Russians continue to bomb parts of Kyiv, and then how will that shape the Ukrainian infrastructure? So if you haven't ever checked out Russia Matters from the Harvard Kennedy Center, it's definitely a source worth your time, worth if you only go on once a week to read their news recap. It does a pretty good job of recapping the week's news, providing some analysis, and giving insights and links that you can go and read more from other scholars, journalists, and academics. Thank you.